Hello everyone, welcome to the Lang Focus channel and my name is Paul. How did Greek influence English? That is the question. As I mentioned in my recent video on the Greek language, Greek is a language that has influenced many others, including English. The most remarkable way that Greek has influenced English is in its vocabulary. In my previous video, I briefly mentioned that around 6% of the vocabulary of English is of Greek origin, but that some estimates reach as high as 12 or 15%. This depends on how you measure it. You can measure type frequency, the percentage of the total number of words with no regard for how often they're used, or you can measure token frequency, meaning the proportion of words in a given speech or text. So words that are more frequently used count for a larger proportion. There's a huge number of words of Greek origin that are used in specialized areas of the sciences, medicine, and technology that aren't used very often in regular speech. So if we measure type frequency, the percentage of Greek words will be higher, because less common words are given equal weight. If we measure token frequency, the percentage will be lower, because less common words are counted less. I believe that the figure of 6% is based on token frequency, and the higher figures are based on type frequency. Some Greek words were borrowed directly from Greek into English. Some of these were borrowed early in the history of English, like church, from the Greek word kudiakon, which entered Old English as kirche. And some were borrowed later in the early modern English period. For example, autonomy. This word entered English directly from ancient Greek, autonomia, in the 1620s. But a larger number of Greek words entered English indirectly through Latin or through Latin then French. For example, museum. This comes from the Latin word museum, meaning library or study. And that comes from the ancient Greek word museon, which meant place of study, library, museum, or school of art or poetry. And if we go back even further to the original meaning of the ancient Greek word, it meant the seat or shrine of the muses. The 9 muses were the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne. They were goddesses who symbolized the arts and sciences. Another example, the word olive entered the English language around the 12th century CE, either from Old French, olive, or directly from Latin, oliva, or oliva, which in turn comes from the Greek word elaiwa. The word chaos comes from the Greek word chaos, and entered English in the 14th century via Latin then French. Catastrophe entered English in the 1530s from Latin catastropha, from the Greek word katastrophe, which was originally pronounced as katastrope, meaning an overturning or a sudden end. The word democracy entered English in the 1570s. It came from the Middle French word démocratie, which in turn came from medieval Latin demokratia, which came from ancient Greek demokratia. The word paragraph entered English in the late 1400s via medieval Latin and French, and it comes from the Greek word paragraphos, which was originally pronounced as paragraphos. And there are many more words like this. The largest number of Greek words to enter English were actually newly created words. They were newly created using Greek morphemes, but they're words that hadn't existed in Greek before that point. And then those words were borrowed from Latin into English. Some are formed from only Greek morphemes. For example, photography. This word was created in 1834 by combining photo, which meant light in ancient Greek, and the ancient Greek suffix grapho, meaning to scratch or to scrape, but later meaning to write. And if you're wondering how those different meanings are related, to scrape and to write, well, think about how people used to write thousands of years ago. They used to scrape letters into stone tablets. Another word, xenophobia or xenophobia. This word was created in 1903 from the Greek root xenos, meaning alien, and phobia, meaning fear. Other words were formed from a combination of both Greek and Latin morphemes. For example, television. This word was created from the Greek morpheme tile, meaning far or at a distance, and the French word vision, meaning sight. This word entered English via French. Another example, automobile. The first part comes from ancient Greek autos, meaning self, and the second part comes from the French word mobile, which means moving, which came from Latin mobilis, movable. Sociology. The first part comes from the Latin word socius, meaning comrade, and the second part comes from the Greek morpheme logia, meaning discourse. Now just have a look at the morphemes that are highlighted. You've probably seen many more words that feature these same Greek morphemes. There are lots of common Greek roots in English. For example, anthrope, meaning man, chron or chron, meaning time, dem, meaning people, ped, meaning child. There are also many Greek affixes, a or an, meaning without, bi or bio, meaning life or living thing, hyper, meaning excessive, micro, meaning small, geo, meaning earth or geography, anti, meaning against, ik, a suffix that forms adjectives, and many more. A huge number of these newly coined words exist in areas of academia, medicine, science, and technology because the huge advancements in these areas over the past 500 years required the creation of lots of new vocabulary. In the field of medicine, for example, Latin words, both old and newly coined ones, were often used for anatomy, while Greek words were used for the names of illnesses or specializations. A lot of these specialized words are not used in daily conversation very often, but without them, it would be very difficult to talk about these advanced fields of study. It's also worth noting that these words are not exclusive to English. A lot of them are used in other languages as well when talking about those fields of study. Here are a couple of hints on how to recognize Greek vocabulary. Most words starting with PH are Greek. Some vowel spellings give us a hint, like AE or OE together. If you see a Y between consonants, it's likely a Greek word. If a word starts with any of these consonant clusters, then it's almost certainly a word of Greek origin. Some of these clusters can't be pronounced in English, like PS or PN or GN, so the first letter is dropped in pronunciation. An interesting example. Back in the 1950s, Professor Xenophon Zolotas, a Greek economist and the 75th Prime Minister of Greece, gave two speeches in which he addressed the audience in English, but using exclusively words of Greek origin, with the exception of grammar words like articles, prepositions, and conjunctions. All of the content words were in Greek. Here is a piece of one of those speeches which he gave to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It is Zeus's anathema on our epoch, for the dynamism of our economies and the heresy of our economic methods and policies, that we should agonize between the Scylla of numismatic plethora and the Charybdis of economic anemia. It is not my idiosyncrasy to be ironic or sarcastic, but my diagnosis would be that politicians are rather crypto-plethorists. Although they emphatically stigmatize numismatic plethora, energize it through their tactics and practices. Our policies have to be based more on economic and less on political criteria. Now let's break that down a little bit. The first part, it is Zeus's anathema on our epoch. This means it is Zeus's curse or punishment on our time or era. In a typical English sentence, you might expect to see God in this context instead of Zeus. For the dynamism of our economies and the heresy of our economic methods and policies. Here he's saying that Zeus's punishment is for the uncontrolled activity of our economies and our economic heresy, meaning violating accepted economic ideas. And next he'll explain what the punishment is, that we should agonize between the Scylla of numismatic plethora and the Charybdis of economic anemia. Now these two words here, Scylla and Charybdis, these are actually characters from Greek mythology. They are two mythical sea monsters, two dangerous monsters that it's difficult to navigate between, because if you move away from one, you move toward the other. Their names here are indicating two dangerous situations. So the first of those two dangerous situations is numismatic plethora. Numismatic means related to coins or currency, and plethora means abundance or a lot of. So these two words together mean inflation, meaning there's too much currency in circulation, so prices increase. And the second dangerous situation, the Charybdis, is economic anemia. Anemia meaning stagnation or loss of energy. Most of the second part is probably easier to understand, but let's look at one part. But my diagnosis would be that politicians are rather crypto-plethorists. Now this word requires a look. Crypto means secret, and plethorists, remember that word before plethora, which means abundance or a lot of, and then ists, that's an affix showing the doer of an action. So plethorists are people who create an abundance of money, they create inflation. Although they emphatically stigmatize numismatic plethora, although they speak badly about inflation, they energize it through their tactics and practices. He's saying that politicians are secretly creating inflation, despite what they say. That's just an excerpt, but I'll leave a link to the full version of the two speeches in the description below. Now the irony of me describing that speech in standard English is that I probably used a lot of words of Greek origin myself without realizing it. So the question of the day, were you surprised to discover how much English vocabulary comes from Greek? Were you surprised by any of the examples? Also, feel free to leave additional examples in the comments down below. Be sure to follow LangFocus on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And once again, thank you to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for their monthly pledges, especially these people right here on the screen. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.